Hello, friends. Welcome back to Colliding Worldviews. Today, in this episode, we're talking about the anatomy of a cult. That, of course, the word cult has some negative connotations attached to it. And that's why we're going to make sure that we unpack that definition that you need to know about today, because there are definitely theological cults out there. And joining me here today is Anna Kitko. She is the regional director of both Tennessee and South Carolina for Ratio Christi, the Campus Apologetics Alliance. She's also the chapter director at the University of Tennessee. So if you are a student there, if you or your daughter, son, grandchild, whoever is in the University of Tennessee area, make sure that they do connect with her and the Ratio Christi chapter that is there. Most of all, last but not least, she is a cults and new religion specialist. And that is why I wanted to have her here today to talk about the anatomy of a cult. And then in the second episode, we're going to get into the world of the Watchtower. And of course, that is referring to Jehovah's Witnesses. And that's great to have you back here on ABN's Trinity channel once again.
I'm delighted. It's always fun to be here.
We are talking about the anatomy of a cult. And that term cult has a negative connotation attached to it. And we want to make it clear to people that when we say cult, and we're talking about this from a Christian perspective, an apologetic perspective, we aren't referring to a social cult. A social cult is usually a small group of people. People think about, David Koresh, the Branch Davidian, usually 50 or less people, a weird group in some way, have some quirks to them. But what we're referring to here is a theological cult, which really doesn't have any size limit attached to it, correct?
That's correct. You're exactly right. We make distinguishing marks between the different cult groups and the different cult types and how you classify them all the time. So yes, social cults can arise and often do arise in most communities. They can be cults of personality where just a really, really emphatic and charismatic leader kind of starts up a group, and they're a little odd, and people kind of can figure out that there's something going on there that's wrong. Jim Jones comes to mind, for example. And then, of course, there are theological cults. And what makes a theological cult is that they're usually a spin-off of an existing religion that has taken that existing religion and they've warped it slightly, or they've started teaching things that historically that religion has never taught, but they're still using the same terminology, or they're still calling themselves, in the case of the vast majority of cult groups here in the States, they use the Bible as a jumping point, but they've redefined what terms in the Bible mean, or they've augmented the scriptures somehow, or they've taken a church setting and turned it into something completely new and different, even though they still call it a church. So yeah, a theological cult doesn't have any type of number distinguishing marks. It can be in the thousands. It can be in 1 to 2 people even. But for the most part, here in the States, our biggest theological cults are in the thousands of members.
And when we talk about cults, if someone says, well, what do you mean by that? Or what groups do you have in mind? Obviously, we would mention the Latter-day Saints, or AKA Mormons, the Watchtower, which we're really going to get into in the second episode, which would be Jehovah's Witnesses. Those are the two main ones that really come to mind. Then we talk about world religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. However, as you had said before, Hinduism, Buddhism, many other man-made religions out there aren't defined or considered theological cults because they weren't a spin-off, or they haven't branched off of Orthodox Christianity. So we just label them world religion. Again, theological cult would be people who usually claim to be Christians, which Mormons do. They would say that they are the true Christians and we are victims of Satan. We're following Satan. Jehovah's Witnesses would also believe that, of course, they are correct in all that they believe, and we are pagan, Trinitarian, or whatever else they want to call us. So definitely theological cults are out there, and these will be the groups who you come in contact with more, because if you're going to school or going to work, there's a lot higher chance that you're going to have a classmate or coworker who is a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness than someone who is part of, like you said, a group like David Koresh's or someone else like that, right?
For sure. Yeah. And I mean, you're still going to come across these individuals as well, especially, I mean, we've had a couple sprout up here where I am. They're just small spin-off groups, you know, an itinerant preacher here and there that starts a church group. But for the most part, the vast majority of the people that you're going to encounter that would belong to a theological cult are going to be exactly what you just said, a Jehovah's Witness or a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints follower, or as we know them best, the Mormons, because those really are our largest theological cults here in the States. Every once in a while you come across a Christian Scientist, but they're pretty rare nowadays. That used to be a pretty large theological cult at the turn of the last century. But now that those reading centers have kind of shut down, we don't deal with that as much unless you find yourself watching in, say, New England. I think they still have a fairly substantial sized membership, enough that you might encounter them at work. But yeah, these guys are the ones you want to really know about, because they're the ones that are going to hold that exclusive claim that they belong to the true church. And that's one of the signs that you might actually be in a cult, is that exclusivity apart from the rest of Christendom. So, for example, the reason why different denominations in Christianity are not labeled theological cults is because the different denominations of Christianity, say Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, we all agree on exactly the same core tenets, and that's the gospel, who Jesus is, that he's divine, that he's, you know, God in flesh, fully man and fully God at the same time, the hypostatic union, these major doctrinal things that we all agree on. And that's what makes us denominations, as opposed to theological cult spinoffs. But a theological cult spinoff is someone who has taken the gospel, or a group that's taken the gospel, and they've altered those core tenets, and yet they still call themselves Christians. And that's when we make that designation, as Christianity Formal would say, no, I'm sorry, that's not Christianity. Whereas these exclusivist groups would say, well, we have the truth and it's our exclusive truth, and unless you're a member of our group, then you're not really a true Christian.
And to help people with that distinction, again, between theological cult and Orthodox Christianity, I believe the title of the book is Convictions Without Compromise by Dr. Norman Geisler. But that makes a distinction between the essentials of the faith and the non-essentials. Because, yeah, you can have two actual born-again, true Christians who disagree on, say, the timing of Jesus's return, or a long list of things that are non-essentials, which is completely different of the timing of an event versus if the event is going to happen or not. And that's usually the case with the essentials and non-essentials. The essentials would be this is going to happen. The non-essential would be when is it going to happen. And of course, when you talk about the theological cults out there, then you have just completely different teaching of who people are, the nature of something. Now, it's no surprise that you don't really find people who have an MDiv joining theological cults. You don't have people who've actually graduated from Christian seminary joining these theological cults. Why do some people join these, and what is it that they are lacking that causes them to usually join them?
Yeah, cult recruitment processes in these theological cults, members are actually taught to prey on certain individuals. You want to look for people who are going through a part of their life that is particularly difficult. They feel spiritually lost or broken in some way. For the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, they actually have cards when they come to your door. They have little cards that they have to fill out after they've met with you, and on those reports, they earmark whether or not, what time of day they were there, who answered the door. Was there a woman who was apparently working from home? Did they have a child with them? Things along those lines. Anything that might give them an idea of how they can approach this person in the future, which is why when you move to a new location, for example, and you first encounter a Jehovah's Witness coming to your door, that interaction is usually pretty short. They don't stay. to do a Bible study. Well, that's because they're going back to assess what's the best way to persuade you, what's the best way to recruit you based on what they learned from when they came to your door the first time. So that's really what you're looking at for the recruitment process. They want to find someone who is vulnerable. It's an interesting dynamic when we classify these groups, and when we put together, our lists of how each of these intergroups and each of these theological cults that are popping up, how they work. You'll notice they really try to stay away from anyone who is dealing with significant illness. There's not a whole lot of recruiting of people that don't at least appear somewhat healthy. So they'll stay away from individuals who are home from work due to like a workers' comp claim or something along those lines. They won't work as hard to recruit those guys because those individuals will not serve to be an efficient recruiters for the group in the future. And it's a fascinating study. You'll notice there aren't a whole lot of, for example, families with mentally ill children or autistic children, for example, in these groups, because these groups really don't want to do the work of making certain that these families feel welcome, that they're served, that there's a purpose, and that there's a relief for them with other families who are experiencing the exact same issues. Whereas in your local church, you can go to your local church no matter who you are, what you're going through, and how you're experiencing life, and you're welcome immediately. It has nothing to do with the circumstances of what's going on. So that's another earmark for recruiting tactics. If you notice these groups are a little too perfect looking, then you can go, well, I don't know what's going on here.
Now, when you in your studies of cults, and please explain undue influence to people so that they are familiar with that and how that connects to the social cults.
Excellent. Undue influence is the process of coercive persuasion, and that's how do you convince a person to stay in a group that is causing them damage, either physically, they can be damaged sexually, they can be damaged financially. How can we best, as a group, this is what the cult will do, how can we best make absolutely certain that this person stays with us as long as possible and is willing to give up their life for the sake of the motivation of either the group itself or the leadership or whoever. And that's the process of undue influence in that study. And what that is when we looked at the scientific evidence behind how the Chinese prison camp members in the 1950s under Mao Zedong, how they were brainwashed. How is it that they were able to take American soldiers and convince them to say and write things that were completely false, that these individuals had never held to these beliefs about Mao Zedong, for example? How did they get convinced to behave in this way after being imprisoned? And we notice there's a type of torture process that's involved in that, and it convinces the person to do and seek any type of conclusion that their perpetrator is looking for the sake of their own personal relief, either physically or mentally. And so when you take the prisoner out of that scenario, out of that environment, they revert back to their original identity. So all the things that they said, they can say, well, I know I said that, but I didn't mean it. I was just trying to get away from the torture, blah, 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 blah. But with undue influence, we're dealing with a completely different scenario psychologically, but it's under the same environmental experiences. So you have an individual who is submitting to an authority that is saying you need to give us all of your financial wealth, you need to submit your entire personality, who you are, your behavior, all your access to information, how you're supposed to react emotionally to things, and you need to convert yourself into the look of the cult. And so what happens in the undue influence process is that because the authority is looked at as not somebody who's causing torture, they're actually looked at as a friend or a guru. When you remove that individual from this group, they never revert back to their original identity. They continue to stay with the identity that they had in the cult group. And that's the whole purpose of that process, is to make it so that if you're a Jehovah's Witness and they've converted, for example, the governing body has successfully persuaded you to become a Jehovah's Witness, it doesn't matter where you are in the world or how far away from the group that you will continue to operate as a Jehovah's Witness no matter what, continuing to recruit other family members, coworkers, things along those lines.
Now, of course, any type of cult is going to be a negative experience ultimately for an individual, whether it's a part of a social cult or a theological cult. Because, of course, in the latter, you have false teachings of Christ, false teachings of who God is, false teachings of how we are reconciled to God. And that's what is so sad about that, is that you have many Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses throughout the world who think they're right with God, but they actually aren't, because they don't understand who God is, who Jesus is. They don't even have the right scriptures that they read from and rely upon. So when you're talking about the theological cult, or you're talking about the social cult, what is the relationship between control and the scriptures? Because in those social cults, you don't really have scriptures like the Book of Mormon or the New World Translation. So what are these similarities and differences between the social and the theological?
Excellent. One of the things that you can track is what's called, we use what's called a BITE model. And BITE stands for, the B stands for behavior, and then the I stands for information, the T stands for thinking, and then the E stands for emotion. And it's how much control does a group expect, and how much control do they actually have in real time over their adherents in those four categories. So, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses restrict most information. You're not supposed to use any other websites besides jw.org. You're seen as treacherous if you try to seek out any type of criticism of the group. You're not allowed to criticize governing body members because they're considered the very mouthpiece of Jehovah. And so that's in the theological cult realm, that's exactly how a social cult also looks. So we're seeing a BITE model extends across all cult networks. It doesn't really matter whether or not they have their own set of scriptures. But obviously in a theological cult, part of the danger is that they've taken the scriptures themselves and they've altered them. And a lot of the adherents don't even realize that they're using an altered text. And then they're not able to ever do any of the research that's necessary in order to identify that it's an altered text. So that's crucial. The control of information is usually the number one marker that you're in a damaging group, is if they do not allow you to go out. And in case several social cults, one of the things with women is that they're told they don't need to go to college. That's still going on now. I mean, it's 2019, and of course women can go to college, and yet they're still operating under this teaching that, well, no, you really don't need to seek any higher education. And you had mentioned, have you noticed that there aren't any MDivs joining these groups? Well, yes, actually, that's part of the problem, is that a lot of these seminary graduates who have seen manuscripts before and know what the Greek and the Hebrew look like will sit there and go, wait a second, no, we are supposed to scrutinize this stuff. That's the whole point of Bible translation, is that we are able to go ahead and scrutinize and compare and debate. And is this really the best way of articulating this particular phrase? Things along those lines. And with the New World Translation, for example, I have one here in my office. We have an interlinear. And this an interlinear is the ability to look at the Greek alongside the English in the scriptures. And their interlinear is correct, but the New World Translation has been altered. So you can even lay their own material side by side and say, well, hey, why is this different?
I have a number of resources here that I was saving until the second episode. One of them was the purple interlinear translation, which aren't as easy to come by as just a basic NWT, but you can definitely get those online. But in reference to cults in particular, again, talking about both social and theological, what is the difference between, if you're following a social cult, if they're not talking about any type of a book or source or Bible, whatever distortion it happens to be, is really just the leader who happens to have the ultimate authority. When you're talking about a theological cult like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., what has the higher authority? The book that they claim is true, or is it still the leader, like it would be in a social cult?
So yes, excellent question too, because it does end up being the leader. So in the Jehovah's Witnesses, you can lay the New World Translation open to Deuteronomy 18, for example, on how to test a prophet, and what's there is accurate on prophecy. And you can say to the governing body, who is they're the guys who are responsible for giving the new light from Jehovah to the people of the Watchtower, and you can say, hey, well, you prophesied that the end of the world was going to be in 1975, and 1975 has come and gone, and the end of the world has not. So you're a false prophet by your own admonition. And they will say, well, no, we are Jehovah's sacred and discreet slave class of people, and the light that we are receiving isn't as clear as you may think it is, and it's getting brighter over time. And so our new revelation is something that's going to supersede anything that's come before. So it's really not right for you to seek to criticize, and the attitude that you have is a demonic attitude, they'll say, for you to seek to criticize us. Same thing with Mormonism, for example, because every single one of their presidents is also a prophet and speaks at the annual conference as a prophet. So I usually use this regularly with Mormon missionaries. The two presidents prior, Hinckley, who's somebody who's been around for the vast majority of millennial missionaries, this is somebody who they would have grown up with, spoke which was essentially ex cathedra, if I can describe it that way. That's how when the Pope speaks and he's speaking for God, he ends up speaking ex cathedra, which means it's supposed to be on par with Scripture. Their president as prophet, and descended from Joseph Smith himself. When they speak, it's supposed to be authoritative on the same level as if God were speaking to them directly. And Hinckley says in one of his presidential addresses that they are not to consider themselves Christians in the same way that the rest of Christendom calls themselves Christians. And if that means they need to stop using the label Christian, then they should. And so it's a very persuasive thing to talk about, because then I can say to the Mormon missionaries who are desperate to tell me that they're Christians just like me, it's just they have a third revelation that I don't have. I can say, well, your prophet says that that's not true. Are you telling me you disagree with the prophet? And that usually helps get them off of their preset talking points.
Now, in some theological cults, and of course, even when you're talking about, like, say, the prosperity gospel, usually felt needs is what will draw a person to join it. What usually draws a person to join a social cult versus a theological? Is it the same thing, a different thing?
It can be. It's somewhat similar in that it's usually, and I say this in a general sense, it's usually emotional relief. That what the cult offers is an immediate honeymoon phase in a process called love bombing. That's when you go to a group, and it's the group, and that, again, love bombing is not necessarily always bad, but it's something that cult groups always use. And that's the process of making certain that brand new people who have just arrived, every single need of theirs is met emotionally, physically, and attempted spiritually. And so that immediate acceptance, that immediate feeling that, oh, well, maybe I found my people, maybe I'm home now, and this incredible love that I'm experiencing puts them into a process or a phase called the honeymoon phase. And that's where this group can do no wrong. And this group has changed their life. And this group is just incredible. And again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the honeymoon phase. When you join a group, that can be very, very positive. The question is, does it stay that way? And with cult groups, it never does. Once you've made it through their normal processing time, you start to have expectations placed upon you. Like, oh, well, you've joined our group, and now it's your responsibility to show this same care to others, and this is how we want you to do it. And then it involves absolutely nothing to do with the care of others. It involves, we need you to sign over your bank accounts. Or the guru wants to spend time with you personally, and that ends up being that they want to spend evenings with you in a very, very inappropriate way, for example. That's where this comes from. That's the vulnerability aspect and the recognition that cult groups use to manipulate individuals who are suffering into a sense of relief, and it's a false relief, and it's a trap, and it ends up enslaving them.
So whereas some people who join the theological cults are going either for felt needs, or they're having a vacuum filled, so to speak. Basically, there's something that they weren't getting before they have found at in this theological cult. People are ministering to them, quote unquote, in whatever way that is. When it comes to the social cults, what is the main difference between the felt? I mean, what's the purpose for actually joining it? With the person themselves? Is usually something that's missing in their life that they find fulfillment in the social cult? Or do you usually find perfectly normal people just being attracted to it because it's some type of outward experience that's appealing to them, or what have you.
Yeah, it can be all of those things. Almost always with social cults, there's a level of manipulation. And so the group is using an ends justify the means type mentality in order to recruit people. And that means they're bald faced lying to them. And so a lot of times with social cults, I have found that exit counseling, for example, for out of social cults is a lot easier than out of theological cults, only because the social cults don't always hit that the felt need of like a spiritual belonging. So like with, for example, there are financial cults, pyramid schemes. These are things that they would qualify under like a social cult category. And once they get into that process, the pyramid scheme, a lot of times people start figuring out that they're being used, and it's a lot easier for them to get themselves out, because they can identify that they themselves are not actually getting the fulfillment they thought they would, or they're not getting the financial bottom line they were promised, or something along those lines. It's a lot easier for them to get themselves out. With theological cults, it's a lot harder to get yourself out, because you are specifically, information's being withheld from you. So a lot of the weird things that we talk about theologically that these groups believe, a lot of that stuff is withheld from new recruits until they are mature enough spiritually to handle it. And so if you prolong that process and you've gotten into these theological groups and they've formed a second family for you, it's a lot easier for you to accept odd bits of information slowly and piecemeal parts, so that you're going slowly into the crazy, as opposed to getting it all up front. And that's one of the tests that we have for people is that if you knew everything that you know about the group that you're in right now, if you knew it back when you first were recruited, would you have joined? And if the answer is no, you're in a cult. If the answer is right. If the answer is yes, you haven't been lied to. So
I was going to say, I mean, when you as a Christian meet someone or hear about someone who just joined the Watchtower or the Mormon Church, you know, especially when you talk with them, they don't have the full Mormon theology all up front. It's like both with the J-Dubs and Mormons, they're kind of taught the theology like on an as needed basis. You know, they kind of build them up. And they either have to be in there for months or years in order to get the deep stuff that they don't tell you up front. Up front, they use these similar terms that make it sound like it's okay. Hey, you believe in God? We believe in God. You believe in Jesus? We believe in Jesus. And it's not until you ask them who is God, who is Jesus, that of course you get a completely different unbiblical answer. And that's why it's so important to know about theological cults. And of course, Anna, as usual, you've been very informative on social cults as well. It's very important for people to know about both of them. Thank you so much for being here on Colliding Worldviews. And we will see you on the next episode when we talk about Jehovah's Witnesses.
My pleasure. I look forward to it.
Friends, share this episode with other people. People need to know about these different types of cults. Negative connotation usually attached to the word cult in general, but what do you mean by cult? A small group of people who just do some weird things? Or is it maybe a large group, millions of people who are following a theological cult because it claims to be Christian, but really isn't? We'll see you next time on Colliding Worldviews.